The Arctic embrace, when New York became a frozen ghost and your world shrank to a candle-lit room. Welcome, fellow dreamers and historical explorers, to another journey down the annals of forgotten, yet strangely compelling, history on boring history to sleep. Tonight, we're not just unearthing dusty old manuscripts or detailing the mundane lives of long-dead emperors. No, tonight we're delving into a history that, for many, remains firmly in the realm of anxious speculation, yet, for countless others, taps into a profound, almost primal fear. The utterly unimaginable scenario of New York City, the invincible, indefatigable, sleepless megalopolis, suddenly, definitively, freezing. Not just a harsh winter snap, not a momentary inconvenience, but a total, bone-chilling, infrastructural paralysis. An Arctic embrace so profound that it silenced the cacophony, froze the relentless pulse, and transformed the sprawling, vibrant tapestry of 8 million souls into something almost unrecognizable for 3 unending days. The narrative we are often sold about New York is one of unyielding resilience, of indomitable spirit, of a city that, no matter the catastrophe, always finds a way to roar back to life, more vibrant and defiant than ever. But what if that resilience was truly, existentially tested by something as elemental and unfeeling as absolute cold? What if the very fabric of its existence, its intricate subway lines, its vast power grid, its subterranean arteries of water, its teeming avenues, succumbed not to external attack or economic collapse, but to the brutal, unwavering, insidious grip of an unprecedented cold? I imagine the usual mental leaps. Surely the greatest city in the world would just handle it. They'd adapt, they'd prevail, they'd grit their teeth and move on. But tonight, we're peeling back those layers of romanticized invincibility to confront the chilling, mundane, utterly miserable, and ultimately profoundly isolating reality of what it truly means when the unyielding spirit of New York encounters an unyielding force of nature. This isn't just about enduring a few frosty nights. It's about the very systematic unraveling of comfort, communication, safety, and ultimately sanity, as the perceived invincibility of a global titan yields to the merciless elements. Before we embark on this truly in-depth, perhaps even sleep-inducing exploration, I'm genuinely curious. Where in the world are you drifting off with us tonight? And what precise time is illuminating your part of the globe? Drop a comment below and let me know. It's always a little comfort knowing we're all connected by this shared moment of quiet contemplation, even as we envision such a dire scenario. The initial tremor of something profoundly amiss always begins subtly, like a dissonant note in the city's endless symphony, a slight snag in the meticulously synchronized machinery that dictates the rhythms of Gotham. My first intimation came, not from an official alert. Those, typically, are the lagging indicators, the slow governmental catch-ups, but from the quality of the light, the peculiar texture of the air, and an indefinable stillness that gnawed at the edges of my perception on that fateful Monday morning. The news reports had, for days, warned of an unprecedented Arctic front, a polar vortex descending with unusual ferocity. But New Yorkers, myself included, are largely a hardy, dismissive breed when it comes to weather. A mere cold snap usually translates into an extra layer, perhaps a grumbled complaint about frozen pipes in some peripheral neighborhood. This morning, however, felt different. Stepping out onto the frosted concrete of my Brooklyn street, The air hit my face not with a crisp, bracing chill, but with an almost physical blow, a dense, metallic cold that felt like breathing in tiny, sharpened shards of ice. The forecast read -20 degrees Fahrenheit, without even factoring in the wind chill, a number that still felt abstract, theoretical, confined to Siberian steppes or Alaskan tundra, not the bustling thoroughfares of Flatbush Avenue. The subway platforms were already in agony. The usual subterranean warmth, generated by 1,000,000 human bodies and the grinding friction of 100,000 moving parts, was absent. Instead, a biting, moist chill permeated the tiled cavern, carrying with it a faint, unsettling aroma of metal and ozone, intensified by the unprecedented low temperatures. My train, always a chaotic beast of delayed inevitability, arrived not just late, but almost tentatively, its usually deafening rumble subdued, its brakes hissing with an unusual, icy friction. Inside, the usual cacophony of conversations and music bleed was muted. Every breath of warm air expelled by the sardined commuters became a miniature cloud, a collective visual testament to the profound cold that had breached the very bowels of the earth, settling within the metallic arteries of the transit system. I recall feeling the shuddering vibrations of the tracks beneath, no longer the familiar roar, but a tense, almost audible strain, as if the steel itself groaned against the unprecedented frigidity. On my walk to work from Penn Station, a normally brisk head-down affair, I noticed a surreal glint, a peculiar texture to the icy patches on the sidewalk. They were no longer simply slick, but appeared almost crystalline, dangerously brittle, splintering underfoot with a sharp crack that echoed eerily in the sparse morning pedestrian traffic. My cell phone, clutched in a gloved hand, had already lost half its charge, a phenomenon I'd attributed to faulty battery calibration, not the initial subtle whisper of something far more systemic beginning to unravel. By mid-morning, the whispers among colleagues turned to genuine concerns. News channels, which typically featured sensational crimes or celebrity gossip, now exclusively broadcast endless, dire warnings from meteorologists, their graphics glowing red with unprecedented temperature drops. The first reports trickled in, isolated burst pipes in century-old brownstones, small sections of the outer borough elevated subway lines grinding to a temporary halt. These were dismissible as anomalies, outliers that always occur in winter. But the aggregate feeling in the chilled air, the tension in the unnaturally quiet offices, began to paint a different, far more unsettling picture. The great heart of New York, usually impervious to the petty grievances of weather, had, for the first time in recent memory, felt a tremor in its pulse. The descent from discomfort to genuine alarm intensified rapidly through day one, a harrowing cascade where each passing hour tightened the icy grip around the city's throat, making every breath visible, every decision crucial, and the ubiquitous urban hum increasingly fractured. As the sun reached its feeble, ineffective zenith, doing little to combat the plummeting temperatures, an unprecedented urgency permeated every shared space, from hushed office cubicles to the increasingly anxious aisles of supermarkets. My own apartment, a supposedly robust pre-war building with formidable heating, began to tell tales of distress. The old radiators, usually hissing with reliable warmth, were struggling, emanating only a faint apologetic warmth, stubbornly insufficient against the plummeting indoor thermometer readings. I shivered involuntarily, wrapped in an extra sweater even indoors. The first profound realization that my sanctuary might not be as invincible as I once believed. Simultaneously, the city's venerable but fragile communication networks began their ominous crackle and falter. Phone calls, even local ones, were now plagued by static and frequent drops, making crucial connections unreliable. Attempts to reach loved ones in other boroughs became exercises in frustration, snippets of hurried warnings or desperate pleas breaking through before silence reigned. Rumors, whispered in the chilling air, replaced verifiable facts of schools sending children home early, only for many to find transit already buckling under the stress, of major traffic accidents freezing solid on icy overpasses, of emergency services always stretched thin, already reporting overwhelming call volumes for burst pipes, carbon monoxide alarms from desperate heating efforts, and incipient hypothermia cases. The sheer, overwhelming pressure on the public to shelter in place, now issued with increasing gravity across whatever few remaining functional news channels existed, collided head-on with an almost primordial instinct to gather food, to hoard supplies, to secure some fleeting sense of provision against the unknown. Supermarkets, those previously bustling bastions of endless consumer choice, transformed into desperate battlegrounds. Bread shelves were cleared in minutes. Bottled water vanished with astonishing speed. Canned goods became precious commodities. Lines snaked out the doors, patrons huddling against the bitter wind, their faces grim, fear now openly etched onto expressions usually reserved for subway delays or rent increases. Cash registers froze, credit card machines sputtered, and often only exact cash transactions were processed, adding another layer of primitive inefficiency to the mounting panic. Returning home from what felt like a foraging expedition, laden with heavy bags, the sounds of the city had taken on an eerie, attenuated quality. The usually pervasive din of traffic, the constant wail of sirens, the murmur of a million conversations, all were fading, absorbed by the super-cooled, thickened air. Instead, new sounds emerged, the distant, hollow thud of what could only be another massive pipeline fracturing under pressure, the desperate, lonely cries of unseen ambulance sirens growing more sporadic and distant, and, ominously, the sickening pop and gush of water, sometimes followed by panicked shouts from apartments mere floors away. The initial flicker of something wrong had now morphed into a stark, unavoidable, all-consuming realization. The city, my resilient, impervious city, was no longer just inconvenienced. It was seizing, visibly, audibly, tragically, succumbing to the cold. The thought of the looming night, not just chilly but potentially without power or water, now ignited a truly profound and inescapable terror, chilling me far more than the bitter Arctic air itself. The full, profound terror truly began as darkness descended upon day one, transforming the already chilling reality into a desperate fight for mere existence for countless New Yorkers, including myself. The evening, instead of bringing the familiar electric glow of a city that never sleeps, ushered in a preternatural, terrifying gloom, punctuated by the agonizing ping of life support systems sputtering and dying throughout our colossal infrastructure. The primary fear I'd harbored was the electricity grid's potential collapse, a pervasive dread in any prolonged severe weather event. Yet, for many like me, the grim reality became an unholy trifecta. Darkness, an unceasing, creeping cold that radiated from every wall and window, and then, with an almost surreal violence, the loss of running water. My power didn't just flicker out. It died with a sudden, unequivocal snap, plunging my apartment building into an immediate, profound darkness that felt suffocatingly absolute after decades of continuous, unbroken illumination. The refrigerator hum ceased its monotonous drone. The glowing lights of routers, chargers, and television screens winked out of existence, replaced by the profound, deafening silence that is usually reserved for the deepest wilderness, not a crowded city apartment. With the power gone, the struggling radiators in my building quickly surrendered, exhaling their last pathetic wisps of residual warmth before succumbing entirely to the rapidly permeating cold. Within an hour, the internal temperature in my apartment plummeted, a shocking, precipitous drop that made every inhale a sting, every exposed inch of skin ache. I frantically pulled out blankets, piling them onto my bed, a pathetic attempt to insulate against an encroaching, frigid enemy that felt increasingly physical. The absence of electricity wasn't just about light or warmth. It was about the insidious creep of impending spoilage in my refrigerator and freezer, rendering my hoarded provisions a ticking time bomb. But perhaps the most jarring development of that frozen night was the insidious death of the plumbing. After a few tentative trickles, the water pressure rapidly diminished, then ceased altogether. The taps, when turned, now emitted only an apologetic, icy sigh. This was no mere inconvenience. This was a fundamental existential threat. No drinking water, no functioning toilets, no sanitation. The bedrock of urban living crumbling with terrifying speed. The pervasive noise of the city, that unending symphony of humanity, had, by then, largely dissipated, replaced by an unsettling, almost deafening silence. What sounds did break through were horrifying. The guttural groan of pipes bursting in adjacent apartments, often followed by the sudden sickening gush of frigid water that resonated through the building's skeletal structure, occasionally punctuated by panicked, despairing shouts from unseen neighbors grappling with localized floods turning instantly to ice. My trusty cell phone, with its precious remaining slivers of battery life, became a flickering beacon of increasingly desperate attempts to contact anyone. Family outside the city, distant friends, anything. But signals were dying. Towers were struggling. Networks overloaded. The few texts that managed to slip through were terse, fear-filled, echoing my own mounting apprehension. Power out. Cold. Water's going. The psychological impact was immense. That night, sleep was a battle against the bitter cold, the gnawing anxiety about food and water, and the crushing realization that the external world had not simply gone quiet, but had ceased to function in any meaningful way. The perceived invincibility of New York had vanished, replaced by a raw, profound vulnerability, turning my familiar sanctuary into a candlelit icebox, surrounded by an unfamiliar, terrifying darkness. Day 2 dawned not with the gradual awakening of a vibrant metropolis, but with the eerie, chilling realization of waking within a profound, frozen stillness that felt entirely alien to New York. The pervasive sound of the city, its eternal thrum and endless din, had been replaced by an almost total, suffocating silence, a soundlessness so profound that it became, in itself, a chilling entity, resonating in my bones and against the walls of my ice-cold apartment. I awoke to a room utterly steeped in frigid darkness, illuminated only by the faint, diffused, ethereal light filtering through heavily frosted windows, a grayish pallor that spoke not of dawn, but of continued bleakness. The internal temperature of my apartment had plummeted overnight to near outdoor levels, probably hovering around 10 degrees Fahrenheit, making every exposed breath a plume of vapor, every movement an effort against the relentless cold that radiated from every surface. The very air felt dense, heavy with static and an indescribable emptiness. The devastating truth hit me with full force. The power, so essential to warmth and life in this modern concrete jungle, remained resolutely, absolutely out. My last, precious sliver of cell phone battery had mercifully given up the ghost overnight, leaving me entirely cut off from even the sporadic, anxiety-inducing flicker of news or desperate communication attempts. But perhaps the most profound shock of this frozen dawn was the total, unequivocal absence of running water. Not a trickle, not a pathetic sigh from the tap, but absolute crushing stillness. My internal narrative shifted instantly from discomfort to survival. How do I drink? How do I clean? How do I dispose of waste? The urban survival instincts, usually dormant under layers of societal convenience, sprang into stark, terrifying action. I pulled back a curtain, peering out at a transformed New York City. The street below was eerily devoid of life. No traffic, no bustling pedestrians, not even the usual hearty garbage trucks that were the bane of my sleep. The thin layer of overnight snow that had dusted the sidewalks and parked cars was no longer pristine white. It had, through a peculiar thermal alchemy, formed into a treacherous, icy crust, glittering ominously in the muted light, reflecting a silence that was almost pathological for this city. Even the omnipresent skyline, a collection of soaring glass and steel giants that usually sparkled with defiant, perpetual light, stood silhouetted against the leaden sky like a collection of colossal, abandoned tombs. It was a tableau of profound desolation. My initial, desperate attempts to melt some snow for drinking water involved crude methods: a small camping stove I'd never used, a metal pot from the back of the cupboard. The snow, when melted, yielded surprisingly little water. Murky and tasting vaguely metallic, yet undeniably life-sustaining in its most primal form. It was a profound, humbling realization of dependence. The extreme cold, both within and without, was not merely an inconvenience but an existential threat to personal health. Exposed skin quickly reddened, stiffened, a painful reminder of the encroaching hypothermia. Even movements inside my insulated layers of clothing were an act of continuous active thermoregulation, every bit of conserved heat precious. This frozen world, a ghostly, beautiful, yet profoundly terrifying transformation of the familiar, was no longer a stage for my daily life. It was a desperate, silent battleground, with survival as the only victory. The silence was the soundtrack to this new, brutal reality, an echoing testament to a city brought to its knees, humbled, and reduced to its most basic, fragile, individual components, each one shivering against the unrelenting might of an indifferent, frozen planet. The cold grip of Day 2 continued its tightening, ushering in an almost immediate era of profound scarcity and stark danger, shattering any lingering illusions of quick recovery, and replacing them with a primal, gnawing anxiety. As the leaden, frozen hours ticked by, the scale of the emergency escalated from an individual plight to a citywide crisis of potentially devastating proportions, felt most acutely in the increasingly desperate search for provisions and the palpable withdrawal of societal infrastructure. With widespread multi-borough power outages still blanketing the majority of the 5 boroughs, the few grocery stores that still harbored dwindling stock, those often operating on unreliable generators, or more primitively, with cash-only transactions by flashlight, became immediate, brutal focal points of desperation. Rumors of fresh deliveries whispered through chilled lips in freezing building lobbies would send waves of anxious neighbors on treacherous expeditions across icy sidewalks and unplowed streets. But these expeditions often ended in stark disappointment. Shelves, if not already entirely bare, offered only the most undesirable remnants, the inedible and the unfamiliar. What was a commodity in the modern world was a treasure now. Even something as simple as a fresh loaf of bread or a liter of water felt like winning a minor lottery ticket, often procured at staggering markups from entrepreneurial, albeit morally questionable, individuals who somehow found ways to exploit the desperation. Gas stations, those ubiquitous arteries of urban locomotion, became inert monuments to a bygone era. Pumps, reliant on electricity, stood uselessly. With most vehicles, if they could even start in the brutal cold, requiring precious fuel for heating or the faintest hope of escape, the immobility became complete. Roads, already rendered treacherous by the crystalline ice, became impassable thoroughfares of abandoned vehicles, frozen debris, and scattered desperation. The lack of operational plows, many unable to fuel up or simply stuck, solidified the city's vehicular paralysis, reducing miles of highways and avenues to dangerous, untraversable traps. More alarming was the growing, palpable absence of what constitutes civil society's bedrock: functional emergency services. The few police cruisers and ambulances that could still move were, according to the intermittent, static-filled AM radio reports, from a battery-powered device I had mercifully discovered in my utility drawer, utterly overwhelmed. Their efforts were focused almost exclusively on critical life-or-death situations, rescuing trapped individuals from burst pipe floods, transporting critical hypothermia patients to severely strained hospitals, or attempting to suppress the earliest signs of desperate opportunistic crime. Routine calls, minor medical emergencies, anything less than outright catastrophe, simply went unanswered. The air was occasionally punctuated by the distant, strained, almost mournful wail of a siren, its sound attenuated by the frigid air, sounding less like a promise of help and more like a ghost echoing a distant, failing hope. This scarcity, this burgeoning state of resource deprivation, transformed every outdoor excursion into a dangerous gambit. The risk of falls on invisible black ice, of suffering frostbite within minutes of exposed skin, of succumbing to the creeping lethargy of hypothermia, were not abstract fears but very real, imminent threats. Any simple act, like fetching snow for melting or checking on a vulnerable neighbor in the building, became a meticulously calculated survival maneuver, fraught with potential peril. The pervasive understanding settled in. The external world, the grand stage of New York, was not merely inhospitable. It had become actively, frighteningly dangerous, transforming a momentary crisis into a brutal, elemental fight against an environment that had seized total, unrelenting control. Every dwindling calorie, every scrap of remaining warmth, became a testament to individual perseverance against the silent, suffocating threat of a city brought to its knees by an unforgiving, pervasive cold. As day 2 stretched into its bitter evening, the profound realities of New York's deep freeze settled into an almost oppressive state of profound isolation and forced introspection. The outside world had retreated not merely beyond the reach of my 5 senses, but also from the realms of communication and comforting certainty. My apartment, now essentially an ice-cold cavern, became the entirety of my world, a miniature, solitary fortress against the unrelenting chill. Trapped within these 4 increasingly frigid walls, my perception of time warped. The relentless demands of managing basic survival, melting snow, meticulously rationing canned goods, trying to extract the last wisps of battery life from any forgotten device, interspersed with long, silent periods of simply trying to stay warm, reduced the vast complexity of metropolitan living to a primal, singular focus. The dwindling warmth wasn't merely from my heavy blankets, meticulously layered, or my remaining scraps of clothing, donned in successive layers until I resembled a vaguely human Michelin Man. It emanated, too, from the sheer proximity of human contact. Neighbors, initially wary, had by now coalesced into small, fragile pods of desperate camaraderie. The small gas burner stove I miraculously got working, after nearly blowing myself up with it once already, emitting only minimal heat but enough for a desperate pot of melted snow, transformed my cramped living room into a rare, precious island of warmth in the desolate, freezing building. This encouraged whispered brief visits, sharing canned goods, huddled figures, exchanging rumors and anxieties like priceless currency, their faces dimly illuminated by the flickering, dancing light of increasingly precious candles. The sight of my neighbor, usually reserved and distant, now bundled in multiple scarves, accepting a meager cup of barely warm, melted snow with a tearful gratitude, became a searing memory of humanity stripped to its most vulnerable core. The sheer silence, previously unsettling, had by this point morphed into an almost oppressive force. No distant traffic, no blaring horns, no wail of emergency sirens. Even those had by now almost entirely ceased, painting an unspoken picture of comprehensive emergency service collapse. The city's normally incessant soundtrack, that eternal urban symphony, had died a chilling death. This left an auditory void filled only by the whisper of the wind against my frozen windows, the ominous creak and groan of an old building succumbing to extreme temperatures, and, profoundly, the frantic, almost frantic beat of my own isolated heart. There was no television, no radio beyond intermittent, faint static from the utility drawer device, no internet. This absence of external noise and ubiquitous media cultivated a terrifying sense of abandonment, of being irrevocably cut off from any verifiable information about the outside world. Are others suffering? Are they getting help? Has the cold broken beyond these walls? The answers were lost to the frozen air, replaced only by mounting apprehension and baseless, self-generated rumors from fearful minds. The profound psychological impact of this isolation, this utter severance from information, began its insidious work. Minds, accustomed to constant stimulation and connectivity, started to wander into darker, more anxious territories. The enforced quiet, initially almost serene, morphed into a claustrophobic pressure, pushing one inward into realms of fear and growing despair. Melancholy settled like another layer of ice around my consciousness. It was a bleak tableau, a single candle flickering defiantly against the encroaching dark and pervasive chill, illuminating faces etched with fear and solidarity, huddled together, fragile human beings in an unrecognizably frozen world. This wasn't New York. This was a brutal, existential vacuum where every whisper, every shared morsel, every fleeting glance of camaraderie felt like a desperate act of rebellion against the crushing, overwhelming indifference of a city brought to its silent, frozen knees. My greatest solace, my desperate cling to some vestige of comfort, came from those moments of shared, fragile human connection, however brief, against the pervasive gloom of what was effectively a dying city. As day 3 sluggishly and cruelly emerged from the relentless grip of a second profound, sub-zero night, a new, unsettling quality permeated the frozen air of my increasingly desolate apartment, a creeping edge of raw, primal desperation. The thin veneer of initial resourcefulness and stoic endurance had begun to peel away for countless individuals, revealing the tender, raw vulnerability beneath. All the last lingering flickers of battery life on any remaining precious devices had definitively given up the ghost overnight. My only functional communication tool, the ancient, sputtering battery-powered AM/FM radio, now yielded little more than fractured static, an unintelligible murmur from a world that seemed to be growing ever more distant, utterly failing to break through the atmospheric interference caused by the profound cold or the inevitable infrastructure collapse. This total communications blackout meant an almost unbearable burden of absolute uncertainty, not just about our immediate fate, but about the very state of the world beyond our immediate frozen street. Was this just New York? Was the whole country, indeed the whole planet, grappling with this same unprecedented, merciless freeze? The questions echoed unanswered in the silent, frigid air. Food, which on day 1 had been a concern, on day 3 transformed into a central, gnawing, physiological demand. The few precious cans I'd salvaged from my rushed supermarket trip now seemed absurdly, pathetically small, a temporary stay against an inevitable hunger. What fresh produce had been initially edible from the now dead refrigerator had long since perished, either frozen solid into useless blocks or simply spoiled. The remaining options were bleak: cold, hard, unappetizing canned goods, often consumed without heating, another dwindling resource of gas canister for the camping stove. Water remained the paramount concern. Melting snow, painstakingly gathered, now yielded a fraction of the desired amount, and the ceaseless exertion of even basic activities in the cold chipped away at one's finite physical energy stores. Hydration was a desperate battle. Whispers from those few, brave individuals who had dared venture out into the unforgiving white wasteland beyond the apartment building spoke of widespread reports of rampant frozen pipes erupting everywhere, entire buildings flooded and subsequently turning into colossal ice sculptures. More tragically, there were hushed, fearful tales of individuals succumbing to the cold, their plight unnoticed or simply unreached by overwhelmed, non-functional emergency services. The soundscape of day 3 was one of morbid stillness, punctuated only by the occasional distant groan of overworked metal from deep within the city's frozen heart. Perhaps an attempt to restart a major boiler or a far-off industrial plant. A futile, lonely gesture against the crushing, pervasive cold. Looking out from my window onto the city, the once bustling street below remained eerily, profoundly lifeless. No buses, no taxis, no pedestrians. It was a ghost town, draped in an unforgiving white shroud that seemed to absorb all sound and swallow all movement. The grand skyscrapers, usually teeming with corporate life, now pierced the gray leaden sky as colossal, uninhabited monuments to a temporarily dead civilization. The sight, terrifying in its desolation, struck me with an almost visceral longing for any sign of normal human existence, any flickering indicator of recovery. Even a traffic jam, a blaring horn, a hurried passer-by, anything to dispel this profound, alien quiet that screamed of collective paralysis and looming systemic collapse. The mental strain of enduring such isolation, coupled with the grinding reality of minimal food and uncertain water, began to truly weigh on my spirit. Dreams were vivid and terrifying, blending survival anxieties with distorted memories of the world that once was. The desire for relief, for an end to this frozen nightmare, was immense, but tempered by the growing, cold realization that even a thaw would likely usher in a different, perhaps equally daunting, set of crises. This was a day defined by the relentless cold gnawing at both body and spirit, leaving us poised on a precipice of profound despair, staring out at a city held utterly captive by the elements, utterly reliant on fragile, individual efforts to simply endure. As day 3 progressed from the depths of a frozen morning into the desolate, unforgiving afternoon, the brutal reality of sustained societal collapse had stripped away all but the rawest forms of human interaction. The grand, anonymous, sometimes indifferent relationships of metropolitan life had, by now, fractured, giving way to the intimate, fragile, yet fiercely resilient bonds of desperate, shared necessity within apartment buildings and across immediate neighborhoods. For countless New Yorkers, the pervasive sense of abandonment by a non-existent central authority, which, unbeknownst to many, was battling its own impossible demons of frozen infrastructure and defunct communication, forced a spontaneous, almost tribal rediscovery of genuine community. In my building, the initial fear-filled whispers had morphed into a quiet, almost methodical understanding. We were on our own, our immediate survival dependent on pooling resources and information. What one apartment lacked in battery power, another supplied with spare blankets. Precious scraps of food, a handful of crackers, a stray can of tuna, meticulously rationed coffee, for the ritual more than the caffeine, were no longer just personal possessions but community assets, shared with a somber dignity. I saw my neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a man I'd rarely spoken to in years, beyond polite nods in the elevator, share his last bottle of filtered water with a single mother down the hall, whose apartment pipes had completely ruptured on the first night. This small act, so simple, yet so profound in its context of looming scarcity, radiated more warmth than any dead radiator. These acts of nascent kindness, these impromptu coalitions of common plight, served as tiny, flickering embers of hope against the crushing indifference of the external freeze. The usually impersonal apartment complex became a fragile village, bound by the shared goal of survival. However, the weight of this newly formed, self-reliant community also highlighted profound vulnerabilities. The desperate measures undertaken were rarely enough for everyone. The specific challenges for various demographics, invisible in the roar of the usual city, now screamed for attention. The elderly, isolated on upper floors with no elevators and often grappling with dwindling medications, refrigerated meds, for instance, now at risk in a dead fridge or just inaccessible pharmacy, faced an immediate, life-threatening crisis. Many simply didn't possess the physical strength to melt snow, chop wood, if they even had access to a fireplace, a rare luxury in a modern apartment building, or navigate treacherous icy stairs to communal areas. Low-income residents living in inadequately insulated buildings, already battling precarious heating or food insecurity even in normal times, were among the first and hardest hit. Their pre-existing vulnerabilities were cruelly magnified 100-fold, leaving them with practically no reserves against this existential onslaught. We, in our fleeting community, tried to identify and check on these silent, forgotten casualties of the cold, but our limited resources, minimal mobility, and fractured communication made comprehensive help an impossible dream. There were stories, fragments pieced together from fleeting, desperate mobile phone signals, of overwhelmed official shelters already turning people away due to overcrowding, or simply because they themselves had succumbed to heating or water failures. Makeshift warming centers in community centers or schools, operating on unreliable generators, were described as packed, desperate, and often just as cold inside as out, filled with a grim understanding of the city's overwhelming paralysis. The profound empathy for others' suffering, mixed with the chilling awareness of one's own fragile position, formed an emotional crucible. The resilience of the human spirit was undeniable, manifesting in countless small acts of defiance against the overwhelming cold. But the bitter undertone was the brutal knowledge that even the fiercest communal spirit might prove insufficient against an indifferent natural force of this magnitude, leaving behind countless unsung heroes and tragic anonymous losses, testament to the indiscriminate cruelty of a city held hostage by the weather. As day 3 slowly, agonizingly bled into its third brutal evening, the emotional pendulum for many in the frozen silence of New York City swung violently between two extremes: tantalizing, fragile glimmers of desperate hope, quickly eclipsed by an equally potent, pervasive sense of overwhelming despair. The unrelenting cycle of extreme cold, profound isolation, and gnawing scarcity had profoundly stripped away any residual sense of complacency, leaving raw nerves exposed and spirits stretched to their absolute breaking point. It was a harrowing weight, a collective holding of breath against the encroaching darkness of another potentially fatal night. Rumors, those persistent, fragile seedlings of information that miraculously sprout in a communication vacuum, became both solace and torment. A frantic shout from a neighboring window, muffled by the pervasive ice, claimed that the power had been partially restored in a distant corner of Manhattan. Another, relayed by a brave soul who'd ventured downstairs, swore that distant, rhythmic thud-thud-thud from far downtown was the unmistakable sound of generators at a major power station roaring back to life, perhaps the precursor to citywide restoration. Each fragment ignited a frantic, desperate hope, an intoxicating vision of warmth, light, running water, the restoration of order, an end to this paralyzing siege. My heart would pound with irrational anticipation, every cold floorboard creak a potential signal, every distant flicker of ambient light an imagined halo of returning power. But these glimmers, fragile as ice crystals, were quickly shattered by the bitter reality outside my window. The sky remained devoid of the usual luminous glow from streetlights, apartments, or Times Square's digital brilliance. Only the icy, unforgiving moon, impossibly bright and cold, gazed down upon a city rendered indistinguishable from a forgotten Arctic wilderness. The omnipresent chill in my apartment continued its relentless work, pushing internal temperatures ever lower. My body, exhausted by constant shivering, by the perpetual mental calculations for calorie preservation and minimal movement, ached with an intense, unyielding cold that permeated even my bones. This physical exhaustion intertwined with a profound psychological weariness. The constant gnawing anxiety of what would transpire overnight, of enduring one more freezing, sleepless night, weighed like a physical burden on my chest. How much longer could meager resources hold out? What irreparable damage was this cold wreaking upon our health, our infrastructure, our collective sanity? The crushing realization was that even if power were to return the following morning, the mere flip of a switch would not instantly rectify the damage. The bitter thaw would usher in an entirely new crisis. Widespread flooding from untold millions of burst pipes, contaminated water supplies from damaged mains, structural issues in buildings that had been violently stressed by thermal contraction. The cleanup, the repairs, the astronomical costs, these looming challenges painted a picture not of immediate salvation, but of a prolonged, grueling aftermath. The longing for relief was immense, almost visceral, but it was tempered by the bitter, stark understanding that salvation, even when it arrived, would come at a devastating price, marking a city indelibly scarred by this unprecedented meteorological assault. This third frozen night wasn't just a battle against the elements, it was a psychological endurance test, pushing against the very limits of hope and endurance, leaving us, the silent, shivering inhabitants of a great city, contemplating not just survival, but the very meaning of normalcy in a world where everything we thought was immutable had been definitively, unequivocally, utterly, brutally broken by 3 relentless days of unforgiving, paralyzing cold. The memory of such vulnerability, etched into the very bones of the city and its people, would last generations, a chilling reminder of fragility in the heart of perceived might. One of the most immediate and profound casualties of New York's sudden freeze, second only to the critical systems of power and water, was its vast, intricate, and typically unstoppable transportation network. For a city built on perpetual motion, on the relentless hum of its subways, the endless rush of its buses, and the furious scramble of its taxi fleets, their systematic paralysis quickly plunged millions into an immobilizing stasis, severing vital lifelines and amplifying a chilling sense of entrapment. My usual morning commute, a mundane routine, transformed into a memory of bygone ease. The first sign, even before the power failed entirely, was the faltering of the subway. Those subterranean veins, carrying millions daily, became unreliable. The immense metallic friction generated by continuous train movement usually generated heat, keeping the tunnels above freezing, allowing electric trains to flow. But with the initial drop in temperature and with the ensuing power flickers and then cuts, segments of the third rail began to freeze solid, obstructing electrical current and physically binding switches. Elevated lines, exposed to the biting, brutal winds, quickly seized. Trains stranded mid-tunnel became chilling coffins, sometimes forcing emergency evacuations through dark, frozen conduits onto dangerously icy streets below. A nightmare scenario that became a horrific reality for thousands. Buses, though more flexible in theory, faced equally insurmountable odds. Diesel fuel gels at extreme temperatures, engines, if they could even start, strained and coughed, or died mid-route as crucial fluids froze. Tires, designed for city streets, found no purchase on roads transformed into slick, crystalline sheets of ice layered over treacherous black ice, often obscured by wind-blown snowdrifts that formed instantaneously. The city's vast network of asphalt became an inert canvas for the brutal elements, filled with abandoned vehicles, quickly rendered inoperable by drained batteries that simply couldn't withstand the frigid startup, or hopelessly mired in treacherous conditions. This wasn't merely about personal travel inconvenience. It was a fundamental societal breakdown. Emergency services, already desperately thin, found their critical mobility drastically curtailed. Ambulances couldn't navigate the glacial maze. Fire trucks struggled to maintain traction, and police cruisers, often stalled, became stranded outposts. Supplies, desperately needed food, fuel for hospitals running on generators, vital medications, were almost entirely unable to enter or circulate within the vast frozen heart of the metropolis. Trucks, reliant on fuel and navigable roads, became stranded on iced-over highways connecting the city to its logistical arteries. The notion of leaving the city, for those privileged enough to have a vehicle and the foresight to fuel it, though finding fuel would quickly become impossible, became a tantalizing yet largely unrealizable fantasy, as all exit routes choked. The very infrastructure of bridges and tunnels, icons of New York's enduring strength, now stood as imposing barriers, often closed or severely restricted due to unsafe driving conditions, freezing road surfaces, and structural integrity concerns caused by thermal stress. The relentless passage of ferry boats and tugboats, usually breaking the river ice, would become intermittent or cease altogether as thicker, unforgiving sheets of ice formed, capable of damaging even reinforced hulls. This entire, usually fluid and relentless ecosystem, this circulatory system of human and commercial transit, seized, turning what was once a source of kinetic energy and constant movement into a monumental monument of frozen stagnation. The great pulsing heart of New York, synonymous with its unceasing movement, had ceased its beat, reducing its millions of inhabitants to immobile, isolated units. For me, observing the frozen street below from my window, the silence of no traffic was not serene. It was a haunting, stark reminder of this absolute paralysis, transforming a world once accessible within minutes into a distant, unreachable mirage, leaving a lingering, profound psychological imprint of utter helplessness. The very veins of the city, once throbbing with life, were frozen solid, locking down everyone within. The loss of heating and electricity in the face of an Arctic blast would undoubtedly plummet New York into an immediate crisis. But perhaps even more foundational and insidiously impactful was the swift, widespread, and devastating collapse of the city's complex water system. For a populace accustomed to turning a tap for limitless potable water, the cessation of this most basic utility transformed daily life into a brutal, often unsanitary, struggle for fundamental hygiene and survival, impacting every single facet of existence with chilling finality. The problems began almost immediately on day one, with isolated burst pipes, older buildings, vulnerable street mains, the inevitable freeze-thaw cycles that wreak havoc on decades-old infrastructure. But as temperatures plummeted, these isolated incidents became an epidemic. Main water lines, often running shallow beneath increasingly frozen streets, succumbed to thermal contraction, cracking open with powerful booms that resonated through the frozen earth, sending torrents of water cascading through underground tunnels before freezing into solid, immobile blocks, severing critical supply to entire neighborhoods. Pressure stations, dependent on consistent temperatures and constant flow, ground to a halt as components froze solid, effectively turning off vast swathes of the municipal supply. My experience, like many others, started with diminishing pressure, then an agonizing trickle, and finally a profound, disheartening silence from the faucets. The profound terror of no water became deeply visceral. This wasn't just about drinking. It was about sanitation. Toilets, those mundane modern conveniences, became immediately useless, backing up without flow, forcing improvisation that quickly bred unsanitary conditions within tightly packed apartment buildings. The health implications for millions without basic hygiene or sewage disposal for days were staggering. A slow-motion public health crisis ticking away in every frozen building. Washing, even a quick rinse of hands, became an extravagant, guilt-ridden luxury, reliant on minuscule amounts of carefully melted snow. Showers were impossible. Cleanliness a quickly vanishing memory, replaced by a pervasive sense of grime and unease that frayed already strained nerves. And then there was the unimaginable horror of fire. What if a major fire broke out, fueled by desperate attempts at alternative heating, faulty generators, or panicked human error? The very fire hydrants that dot every street corner, the first line of defense against urban infernos, would be rendered utterly useless, frozen solid, their internal mechanisms seized by ice. Firefighters, if they could even navigate the impassable streets, a huge if, would face an impossible task. Battling blazes in a city without water. The prospect was truly terrifying. Of buildings once proud and sturdy, reduced to ashes because the very element designed to fight such devastation was an ice sculpture. Emergency water delivery, usually a core component of disaster response, was non-existent. Without functioning roads, without ample, accessible fuel, without a vast, unfrozen supply, tankers could not move, let alone reach a city trapped in a deep freeze. Bottled water, a panic buy on day one, quickly became depleted, the demand far outstripping the shattered supply chain. Melting snow, that crude, laborious solution, yielded frustratingly little, often with questionable purity, forcing a harrowing decision between hydration and purity in a desperate gamble for survival. The mental shift was stark, from passively expecting flowing water to meticulously rationing every drop, to endlessly considering the desperate mechanics of melting dirty snow, or worse, collecting runoff. This critical infrastructure collapse permeated every minute of those 3 frozen days, stripping away the foundational expectation of cleanliness and hydration that define modern urban life. My parched throat, the grim reality of unhygienic conditions in the building's common areas, and the constant nagging anxiety about potable water etched a profound understanding. New York's might was profoundly ephemeral when its basic hidden arteries froze. The silence from the taps became a constant, terrifying reminder that even for millions of dollars, the one thing you desperately needed to live, quite simply, was gone. Perhaps one of the most terrifying, disorienting, and ultimately psychologically debilitating aspects of New York's deep freeze would be the immediate and comprehensive communication blackout that blanketed the city, isolating millions of individuals within their physical confines and severing almost every link to the outside world, to information, and to vital reassurances. In an age of pervasive connectivity, the sudden cessation of all normal forms of communication would not just be an inconvenience, it would be a profound existential crisis, fostering unprecedented levels of fear, rumor, and profound loneliness. The first domino to fall was, as expected, cellular service. With widespread power outages across countless neighborhoods and backup generators designed for limited temporary use, struggling or failing in the extreme cold, cell towers, those towering digital lifelines, began winking out of existence one by one. My own mobile phone, which in a normal emergency is a source of infinite reassurance, became nothing more than a lifeless, expensive brick once its precious internal battery reserves finally dwindled to zero on the eve of day 2. Even before its ultimate demise, service was patchy, sporadic, utterly unreliable. Frantic texts would fail to send for hours. Voice calls would connect only to sputter and drop within seconds, making genuine information transfer a frantic, desperate gamble against technological breakdown. This wasn't just a lost luxury. For many, it meant the terrifying inability to check on elderly parents, children in distant parts of the city, or friends in precarious situations. It meant emergency services. Even those functional would have no central dispatch, no reliable means to coordinate or communicate outside a localized radio network. But the silence didn't stop at cell phones. Traditional landlines, though some still functional on limited power grids for local calls, also faltered as local switching stations lost power or sustained physical damage from freezing. Entire apartment buildings went dead, physically severing the final vestiges of telephonic connection. The Internet, that boundless ocean of information and distraction, died with the electricity. Routers, modems, servers, all offline. No news websites, no social media, no emails, no satellite connections beyond potentially a handful of critical government outposts running on secure lines that wouldn't service the general public. This left a complete void where endless information once flowed, fueling speculation and raw, unverified rumor that spread like wildfire among isolated building communities, compounding anxieties with every desperate whisper. Radio and television, traditionally the stalwart bearers of crucial emergency information, also suffered a crippling demise. Local stations, unless powered by robust multi-fuel generators that somehow miraculously withstood days of sub-zero temperatures, an extreme rarity, also went dark. Those few battery-powered radios, like my ancient device from a dusty utility drawer, often received nothing but a furious cacophony of static, the sheer density and frigidity of the air disrupting even powerful signals. When an intelligible voice did occasionally crackle through, it was often short, ominous bursts from distant NOAA weather radio broadcasts, painting a grim picture of wider regional devastation, with little local, actionable intelligence. The profound psychological impact of this universal communications blackout cannot be overstated. Accustomed to constant stimulation, endless information, and the comforting umbilical cord of global connectivity, millions were suddenly plunged into an archaic void of profound isolation. This isn't the intentional disconnection of a relaxing digital detox. It's a terrifying, involuntary severance that fosters debilitating anxiety, paralyzing uncertainty, and an intense, overwhelming sense of being truly abandoned to fate. Every distant noise becomes an imagined message, every rustle an unconfirmed event. Without shared, verified facts, suspicion festers, fear multiplies. The normal social cohesion of a city breaks down not just through lack of resources, but through a terrifying absence of shared understanding, or even basic acknowledgement of others' existence beyond their immediate, freezing walls. My deepest fear during those hours of silence wasn't just the cold, but the absolute crushing isolation, the terrifying reality of being utterly alone in a once vibrant city, completely unable to communicate or be communicated with, listening only to the frantic pounding of my own isolated heart as the terrifying stillness of a city without a voice encompassed me. The fragility of modern urban life, a towering edifice built on intricate global supply chains and hyper-efficient logistical networks, would be brutally exposed when New York froze for 3 days, revealing a fundamental truth about food and supply chains. They are far more vulnerable to elemental forces than we typically imagine. What began as a mild inconvenience of scarcity on day 1 quickly spiraled into a harrowing struggle for basic provisions by day 2 and 3, plunging countless New Yorkers into a profound existential food crisis. The illusion of endlessly stocked grocery shelves, perpetually replenished, was one of the first psychological comforts to be violently shattered. As soon as word of the unprecedented cold spread, even before widespread outages, an initial instinctual surge of panic buying emptied the freshest, most appealing produce from store aisles. By the time my power gave out and temperatures plummeted, turning refrigerators into inert boxes, food spoilage became an immediate, critical concern. Dairy, meat, fresh vegetables, anything that required consistent refrigeration, instantly became a ticking time bomb, destined for an undignified, rapid decay. Even without the power, if you still had your groceries on day 1 evening, you couldn't eat it the morning after. For millions, their remaining sustenance would quickly be reduced to the unappetizing, nutrient-limited domain of canned goods and dry pasta, often consumed cold, unheated, simply to conserve precious remaining energy sources for other critical needs. The true problem, however, extended far beyond the depleted stock within existing city limits. New York City, by its very nature, is an immense consumption engine, wholly dependent on a continuous, uninterrupted inflow of supplies from vast distances, food from across the continent, fuel from global markets, vital medications from distant factories. When the city's transportation arteries seized, highways impassable with ice and snow, fuel lines frozen, ports unable to function amidst massive ice flows on the Hudson and East Rivers, cargo trains hopelessly stuck on frozen rails. This continuous circulatory system for supplies instantly suffered a catastrophic embolism. Trucks, the lifeblood of urban resupply, simply couldn't reach the city. Drivers, even if they could overcome extreme weather in outer areas, would hit a wall of impassable, frozen infrastructure at the city's perimeter. This wasn't a mere disruption. It was an absolute cessation of replenishment, stores, even those still limping along on partial power or generator power, had nothing new coming in. Their already decimated shelves quickly became entirely bare, forlorn monuments to absent abundance. The lack of operational gas stations meant that even local, small-scale resupply efforts were impossible. There was no fuel for delivery vans, no means to operate smaller refrigerated vehicles. The implications for different segments of the population were profound. For low-income neighborhoods and food deserts, already grappling with limited access to fresh, healthy provisions, the situation became critical almost instantaneously. Vulnerable communities were cut off from even their meager local supply points, leading to rapid and acute hunger. For others, basic survival tactics came to the fore. Families, often huddled around small camping stoves, using precious, dwindling canisters of gas, resorted to minimalist cooking. Melting snow for boiling canned soup, if a soup existed, cold instant noodles, dry cereal eaten with water instead of milk. Each calorie became precious, each meal a testament to careful rationing. The concept of dining out, a core part of the New York experience, became an obscene, distant memory. Restaurants without power, water, or fresh ingredients would shutter almost immediately, their gourmet kitchens transformed into freezing, inert mausoleums of gastronomic dreams. The pervasive scarcity, the constant gnawing hunger that subtly eroded one's concentration and physical strength, the fear of impending famine, all contributed to a profound sense of anxiety. The memory of perfectly stacked grocery aisles, brimming with choice, would haunt every hungry New Yorker, a stark contrast to the barren reality, transforming what was once infinite choice into desperate deprivation, proving that the modern city's greatest strength, its abundant consumerism, was also its Achilles heel in the face of nature's raw power. The very infrastructure of care and emergency response in New York, a formidable network designed for crisis management under even the most dire circumstances, would be profoundly and perhaps irrevocably overwhelmed by a 3-day deep freeze, pushing the valiant professionals within to the absolute brink of human endurance and moral compromise. Hospitals, typically sanctuaries of healing and resilience, would transform into desperately overstrained triage centers, battling an invisible enemy of escalating casualties and diminishing resources. My mind reeled at the reports, overheard on a fleeting AM radio crackle, that emergency rooms were operating on a skeleton staff, often entirely reliant on sputtering generators. These generators, not built for days of continuous extreme cold weather operation, began to falter, their fuel reserves dwindling, their mechanical components stressed by constant running at sub-zero temperatures. The pervasive lack of consistent power would compromise critical medical equipment. Respirators, diagnostic imaging machines, essential warming blankets, entire operating theaters, reducing state-of-the-art facilities to dangerously basic levels of care, reminiscent of a battlefield MASH unit rather than a modern hospital. But the challenges were far more fundamental. Without running water, critical sterilization processes became impossible, jeopardizing patient safety and promoting infection. Toilets in every hospital would cease to function, creating immense biohazard risks in environments already dealing with critical biological waste. Without functioning heating systems, maintaining stable, therapeutic temperatures for patients, many already critically ill or susceptible to hypothermia, became an agonizing battle, further stressing patients already in profound distress. Emergency medical personnel, even the most dedicated, faced insurmountable hurdles. Ambulances, those indispensable harbingers of hope, often couldn't navigate the impassable, ice-bound streets, their engines seizing, their fuel gelling, their sirens fading into silence. Patients suffering from acute hypothermia, from those trapped in freezing homes or stranded outdoors, carbon monoxide poisoning, from desperate attempts at alternative heating, burst pipe injuries, or simply a collapse of existing medical conditions without access to heating or regular care, would be brought to overwhelmed emergency rooms or simply remain unreached entirely. The decision-making would turn starkly ethical. Triage, always a brutal necessity in mass casualty events, would be enforced with an uncompromising severity rarely seen. Who gets the last functioning ventilator? Who gets the last available warming bed? Who is deemed savable and who, tragically, must be left to a desperate comfort care in a freezing hallway? If that, the immense moral burden on doctors, nurses, and first responders, forcing them to make these impossible choices with ever-dwindling resources and profound fatigue, would be devastating, leaving deep, lasting psychological scars on even the most hardened professionals. The heroes of such a freeze would be largely silent, operating beyond the reach of media reports, battling overwhelming odds with courage and often with despair. Their immense struggle to transport critically ill patients, to reach homes where vulnerable citizens lay helpless, to maintain rudimentary medical functionality in compromised hospitals, often battling severe personal frostbite or their own physical exhaustion, would represent a profoundly grim yet undeniably heroic effort. These are the unsung combatants against an indifferent, unfeeling elemental force that systematically attacked every foundational component of their ability to provide care. My own anxieties, shivering in my darkened apartment, were frequently interrupted by terrifying thoughts of these selfless individuals, caught in an impossible, ultimately unwinnable struggle to sustain life in a city where every system designed to support them had fundamentally betrayed them. The very definition of emergency itself became tragically warped. When everything is an emergency and every responder is either stuck, struggling, or simply out of fuel and resources, then the very concept of timely aid vanishes, replaced by a desperate, lonely battle against insurmountable odds, rendering even a bustling, hyper-modern hospital little more than a fortress of desperation, trying to ward off the unrelenting advance of death in a frozen city. For those residing on the absolute margins of society, the 3-day deep freeze of New York would morph from a profound crisis into an immediate, irreversible, existential catastrophe, delivering a particularly cruel and swift hammer blow to the city's vast homeless population and countless vulnerable groups. This segment of society, perpetually unseen and often ignored in the ceaseless dynamism of a normal New York, would suddenly be thrust into the chilling forefront of the freeze's merciless casualties, their desperate struggles almost entirely subsumed by the overwhelming collapse of systemic care and information. Consider first the sheer vulnerability of the homeless population. For tens of thousands, their only home is a park bench, a cardboard box under a bridge, an alleyway doorway, or a grimy subway grate, seeking tenuous warmth from perpetually leaking steam. Their attire, typically meager and unsuited for anything beyond ordinary urban winters, would offer absolutely no protection against sustained temperatures of -20 degrees Fahrenheit and crushing wind chills. Within hours, frostbite would begin its insidious, irreversible work, seizing exposed extremities. Within a full day, hypothermia, the silent, pervasive killer, would likely claim countless lives. There would be no escape, no warmth. Emergency shelters, already perpetually underfunded, understaffed, and routinely overflowing even during moderate winter storms, would be rendered utterly inadequate, paralyzed, and perhaps inoperable by the deep freeze. Their heating systems would likely fail, their water lines would certainly rupture, and their skeleton crews, unable to commute, would be unable to provide the most rudimentary care. The overwhelming influx of new emergency cases, people whose pipes had burst and were desperate for any indoor refuge, would completely saturate the already critically strained shelter system, forcing agonizing decisions about who to turn away into the brutal, unforgiving cold. Those who managed to squeeze into a rudimentary shelter would find it to be barely warmer than outside. A chilling parody of safety, its floors likely packed with frozen, huddled figures, the air thick with despair and human desperation. But the hidden casualties of such an extreme weather event would extend far beyond the immediately visible homeless population. There are millions of elderly individuals, often living alone, on fixed incomes, in inadequately insulated or poorly heated buildings. Some grappling with debilitating health conditions requiring consistent warmth and refrigeration for their medications. The collapse of heating systems in their buildings, the failure of electricity to power their medical devices, or the cessation of access to running water would put their lives in immediate grave peril. Without functioning communication lines, the ability for social services to check on these vulnerable residents, to coordinate their evacuation, even if an evacuation were possible, or to deliver emergency supplies, would be entirely eliminated. Countless other vulnerable groups, those with severe disabilities, single-parent households without adequate resources, low-income families whose children were suddenly trapped in freezing, darkened homes, unable to access food, would find their fragile existences shattered. Each of these groups, traditionally shielded, however imperfectly, by a social safety net, would suddenly fall through the yawning, icy chasm of a non-functional city. This tragedy wouldn't make the headlines of the future in a detailed, census-like fashion. Their suffering would be largely silent, unseen, uncounted in the general pandemonium. These would be the hidden, anonymous losses, the forgotten names swept away by the brutal efficiency of a natural force against a society unprepared to truly protect its weakest links when its very foundational systems shattered. My shivering nights were frequently haunted by the image of a freezing individual on a park bench, by the imagined struggle of an elderly neighbor unable to walk the icy stairs, by the unspoken despair of a family with hungry children in a dark apartment. This collective suffering, this grim realization of the systematic failure of even the most basic human empathy, was the ultimate bitter, heart-wrenching legacy of those 3 brutal, frozen days. New York's vulnerability, so often projected onto its powerful facade, would be cruelly manifested in the anonymous, quiet suffering of its most defenseless citizens. testament to a collective breakdown of care. The sheer aesthetic transformation of New York during the deep freeze, usually bustling with vibrant energy, deafening noise, and relentless activity, into a monochromatic, eerily silent, frozen tableau would be a haunting spectacle. The city's iconic landmarks, those towering symbols of human achievement and metropolitan permanence, would themselves take on an unfamiliar, unsettling majesty in their icy embrace, stripping away their context and rendering them alien landscapes. Times Square, usually a retina-searing explosion of neon, LEDs, and frenetic digital billboards, ceaselessly projecting images and advertisements, would be plunged into an unearthly, absolute darkness. The gigantic screens, now cold black glass, would stand as silent, dead monuments to an absent consumerism, their vibrant messages extinguished, leaving only the grim, gray skeletons of their scaffolding under the muted light of a leaden sky. The silence in what is typically the loudest corner of the world would be profound, almost blasphemous. Imagine walking across a deserted Broadway, the very stage for theatrical spectacle, now choked with snowdrifts and sheets of ice, the iconic theaters darkened, their marquees proclaiming phantom plays. The freezing air, no longer a backdrop for conversation but a heavy presence, would amplify every faint creak of frozen metal, every distant, unidentifiable groan, transforming the world's most bustling crossroads into a haunting, frozen graveyard of light. Central Park, usually a living, breathing lung of the city, bustling with joggers, dog walkers, and the sounds of laughter and play, would be transformed into an expanse of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. Its expansive meadows would become sheets of unblemished, crystalline white, reflecting the frigid, dull light. The bare branches of its ancient trees, usually vibrant green or fiery, red, would be coated in thick rime ice, sparkling like countless fragile diamonds under the meager light, creating an otherworldly, skeletal forest. The lakes and ponds, typically teeming with wildlife and often navigated by rowboats, would be utterly, impenetrably frozen, transformed into colossal sheets of dark, opaque ice, a chilling reflection of the leaden sky. Even the ubiquitous Central Park rocks, those geological outcrops usually covered with human life and graffiti, would be stark, forbidding structures, themselves sheathed in a pristine, glistening layer of frozen moisture. The air, crisp to the point of pain, would carry an uncharacteristic purity, devoid of urban pollution, replaced by a metallic tang of profound cold that seemed to amplify every sparse, crunching step. It would be a stark, silent wilderness in the heart of the once bustling city, and the iconic structures. The Statue of Liberty, typically a verdant green sentinel, would stand against the icy, leaden waters of the harbor, a monumental silhouette of dark copper, possibly encrusted with wind-blown ice and snow. Her flame, the enduring symbol of hope, would be unlit, a stark and profound testament to a temporarily extinguished beacon. The colossal suspension bridges, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, usually vibrating with endless traffic and thronged by pedestrians, would be ghostly, empty, frozen arteries, their intricate cable structures appearing as giant spectral harpstrings, eerily shimmering under an icy glaze, spanning frigid, partially frozen rivers where shipping had ceased. Their grand scale, normally dwarfing human life, would now be contrasted against the profound stillness, the complete absence of human activity. The stark, desolate majesty of a city seized by absolute zero, its every monument hushed, inert, and yet eerily beautiful, would etch an indelible, somber memory onto the consciousness of any who witnessed it. A potent reminder that even the grandest creations of humanity can be humbled into desolate, frozen landscapes by the sheer, unfeeling indifference of nature's brutal power. As the protracted grip of the deep freeze maintained its suffocating hold on New York, an extraordinary transformation would occur in the very sensory fabric of the city, its soundscape and atmosphere. What defines New York for most of its inhabitants is an unceasing, pervasive, inescapable symphony of noise, a chaotic, often abrasive, but profoundly invigorating cacophony that acts as the constant backdrop to existence. But in a city silenced by absolute cold and infrastructural collapse, that symphony would die, replaced by a haunting, pathological silence and a peculiar, unsettling odor that spoke volumes of systemic breakdown. The initial cessation of traffic, the dying hum of the subway, the absence of construction din, these would gradually give way to an almost total vacuum of sound. Imagine standing on a formerly bustling avenue like Fifth Avenue or Broadway, shrouded in heavy winter gear, and hearing nothing but the muffled thump-thump of your own heartbeat, amplified by the pervasive stillness. This isn't the tranquil quiet of a snowy countryside. It's the unsettling, deafening silence of millions of machines gone dead, of millions of human voices hushed by the struggle for survival. The only sounds to break this profound emptiness would be the elemental ones. The mournful whistle of wind whipping between the now silent skyscrapers, making the steel giants creak and groan with unnerving regularity, as if the very bones of the city were straining under thermal contraction. The sharp, crystalline crunch of a single footstep on hardened, treacherous snow, the eerie pop of unseen frozen branches, or the unnerving whoosh of an enormous unseen piece of ice falling from a skyscraper, crashing into the frozen streets below, echoing for what felt like miles. Beyond the auditory void, the very air, stripped of its usual warmth and vitality, would begin to carry a new, disturbing bouquet, an olfactory testament to the city's profound suffering. In a fully functioning New York, sanitation services operate with relentless efficiency, their growling trucks a familiar part of the daily grind, hauling away tons of refuse. With a 3-day deep freeze, garbage collection would cease immediately. Without operational vehicles, fuel, or personnel able to commute, vast amounts of accumulated waste would simply sit, frozen in place, in black bags and overflowing dumpsters on sidewalks and back alleys. While the intense cold would initially prevent putrefaction and mask the stench, an unsettling underlying scent, a metallic sharpness mixed with the faint, stagnant odor of frozen decay and general immobility, would subtly permeate the air. Further compounding this grim olfactory landscape would be the chilling reality of non-functional sewer systems. While not immediately apparent to those confined to their freezing apartments, since pipes would rupture and block the outflow rather than directly overflow into homes for the first couple of days, depending on internal damage, the overall network of human waste disposal would be fatally compromised. This would inevitably lead to raw sewage accumulating in unheated, freezing pipes and eventually backing up into the subterranean depths of the city, potentially leaching into the groundwater once thawing began, posing an unprecedented public health crisis down the line. But even in the midst of the freeze, the subtle, cloying scent of stasis, of biological and mechanical processes halted, would contribute to a profound, unsettling atmosphere. The cold itself would carry a particular metallic scent, distinct from any ordinary winter, a dry, almost painful aroma that seemed to crystallize in one's nostrils. This unsettling stillness, coupled with the faint, grim odor of a city in suspended animation, would paint a bleak psychological portrait. My most enduring memory from those days, beyond the pervasive cold, is that deafening silence, a quiet so profound, so absolute, that it felt heavier than any noise. It stripped away the familiar, replacing it with an unnerving sense of utter emptiness and profound isolation. This transformed urban decay wasn't just physical. It permeated the very sensory experience, subtly yet powerfully underscoring the chilling fragility of a metropolis silenced by nature's merciless grip. New York, stripped bare of its sensory dynamism, would reveal its desolate, frozen soul, a stark reminder of its tenuous connection to the delicate balance of the natural world. The deep freeze, beyond its immediate physical destruction and widespread logistical collapse, would unleash a potent, pervasive wave of psychological aftershocks across New York City, leaving an indelible imprint on the minds and hearts of its survivors. For millions, the experience would be profoundly traumatic, irrevocably altering their sense of security, their trust in institutional resilience, and even their most fundamental interpersonal relationships, echoing the long-term impact of other major urban disasters. Initially, during the 3-day ordeal, the overriding emotion was visceral fear, fear of the cold, of hunger, of sickness, of absolute isolation, of death. But after the immediate thaw, once the physical danger had passed, these raw survival instincts would recede, giving way to a complex tapestry of lingering anxiety and deeply rooted mistrust. There would be a pervasive sense of insecurity. The myth of New York's invincibility, its ceaseless heartbeat, its indefatigable spirit, would be shattered for countless individuals. Where was the all-powerful city during those 3 frozen nights? Why did the infrastructure fail so completely? Why were help and communication utterly non-existent? These questions, born of vulnerability, would breed a profound mistrust in governmental and municipal authorities, leading to cynicism about their capacity to protect citizens in future crises, potentially undermining social cohesion and collective action. People would question the very promises of urban living, leading to a lingering collective trauma. The sheer sight of miles of ruptured pipes, flooded homes, structural damage, and the visible aftermath of desperation would be a daily, haunting reminder of systemic fragility. Moreover, the forced intimacy and brutal exigencies of survival within apartment buildings would produce complex social dynamics, forging unbreakable bonds of solidarity for some, while fracturing existing relationships and fostering suspicion for others. Acts of selfless heroism, of shared resources and desperate mutual aid would create profound community ties that lasted a lifetime, uniting neighbors who were once strangers through a crucible of shared suffering. These spontaneous horizontal networks of aid, born of necessity, would fundamentally alter many New Yorkers' perception of their immediate surroundings, making their building or block feel more like a village than an anonymous collection of dwellings. However, For every tale of generosity, there would inevitably be dark narratives of selfish hoarding, desperate opportunism, and acts of regrettable desperation or outright malice that strained neighborly relations to their breaking point. The pervasive sense of every man for himself that subtly simmered during peak desperation would leave a bitter residue, creating enduring resentments and a heightened sense of vigilance against future scarcity. Neighbors might never forget who refused to share a spare battery, or who attempted to profit from the suffering. These fractured bonds, these deep-seated interpersonal suspicions, would be invisible scars across the social fabric of the city, affecting relationships for years to come, a silent price paid for shared adversity. Beyond these specific social and institutional impacts, there would be a more general, insidious erosion of inner peace. The comforting assumption of readily available power, clean water, warm homes, and instantaneous communication, the very bedrock of modern, convenient existence, would be forever undermined. Future weather warnings, typically met with a shrug, would now evoke disproportionate anxiety. The subtle sound of wind outside, or the creak of an old building, might trigger flashbacks to the terror of the freeze. This heightened sensitivity, this low-grade, perpetual sense of vulnerability, would diminish the general psychological well-being of the city's survivors. Sleep itself might become troubled, haunted by the memory of frigid, isolated nights. The mental space once occupied by career ambitions, cultural events, or daily worries would now be intermittently invaded by nagging concerns about emergency preparedness, the security of basic utilities, and the profound realization that the veneer of modern convenience is terrifyingly thin. The experience of New York frozen for 3 days would be far more than a weather event. It would be a collective trauma, permanently etching itself into the city's consciousness, leaving an indelible legacy of profound vulnerability, complex social dynamics, and a lasting re-evaluation of the preciousness of basic human comforts in the face of nature's relentless, unforgiving might. The very soul of the city, once thought unbreakable, would be profoundly, and perhaps forever, altered by the terrifying fragility it witnessed in those few short, brutal, frozen days. The agonizingly slow, grinding return to a semblance of normalcy after New York's 3-day freeze would be less a glorious triumph and more a painful, arduous, often heartbreaking testament to the true cost of infrastructural collapse and the tenacious but ultimately messy work of repair and recovery. Power would, eventually, trickle back, not with a citywide bang, but with a series of localized, tentative flickers, neighborhood by neighborhood, often leaving adjacent blocks still shrouded in chilling darkness, creating immediate inequities in suffering and relief. For those of us enduring those harrowing days, the first faint glow of a streetlight, or the timid hum of a refrigerator finally restarting would be met with an almost dizzying blend of exhausted relief and cautious trepidation. The initial rush of warmth and light would be intoxicating, a visceral reaffirmation of civilization's return. But this fragile relief would quickly give way to the overwhelming, pervasive reality of widespread physical devastation. The moment the mercury rose and the city began its painful thaw, the true scale of the catastrophe that lay hidden within its frozen veins would erupt into stark, chaotic visibility. Burst pipes. Millions, possibly tens of millions of pipes in ancient brownstones, modern high-rises, subterranean subway tunnels, Vital utility lines and forgotten commercial basements would have ruptured under the brutal thermal stress. The thawing water would turn into massive, citywide floods, cascading through buildings, over streets, and into the deep infrastructure, overwhelming drains, sewerage systems, and potentially causing widespread contamination. Entire buildings would face immediate condemnation, their interior structures soaked, warped, and covered in ice, requiring unimaginable efforts of drying, demolition, and repair. The financial toll of this aftermath would be astronomical, unprecedented in modern urban history. Insurance companies, inundated with millions of claims for water damage, burst pipes, and property loss, would buckle under the sheer volume. Contractors, plumbers, electricians, and heating engineers, already in high demand even in normal times, would become an almost mythical, inaccessible resource, commanding exorbitant fees as desperate property owners faced catastrophic structural and utility failures. The repair bills, from replacing entire plumbing systems to restoring basic heating and electrical grids across thousands of buildings, would bankrupt individuals, devastate businesses, and utterly overwhelm city and state coffers, impacting the city's economy for years, if not decades. Beyond the financial and physical, the societal fabric, once thought unbreakable, would forever carry the indelible scars of those brutal 3 days. A subtle yet persistent trauma would linger, manifesting as heightened anxiety whenever weather warnings loomed, a deep-seated suspicion towards public infrastructure, and an acute awareness of the fragility of modern life, even in the heart of what was considered an indomitable city. The sounds of emergency sirens, once a comforting reassurance of order, might now evoke a subtle dread, recalling the days when they faded to silence. The memory of perfectly stocked grocery aisles, once taken for granted, would be replaced by the haunting image of empty shelves, fostering an unconscious tendency towards hoarding and a pervasive mistrust in the consistency of supply chains. The invaluable bonds of desperate community formed during the freeze, those moments of spontaneous human kindness, would certainly leave their own lasting positive legacy, knitting together neighborhoods in new, profound ways, creating a deep-seated empathy and understanding for shared adversity. Yet those indelible memories of selfish opportunism and profound abandonment would also persist, fostering lingering resentments and suspicion between those who pulled together and those who exploited, between those who gave aid and those who felt ignored. The iconic skyline, the bustling streets, the vibrant pulse of New York City would undoubtedly return. But beneath the surface for millions, the world would have irrevocably shifted. The swaggering confidence, the unshakable certainty of infinite possibility that so defines New York, would forever be tempered by the chilling, unforgotten memory of absolute vulnerability. That the very foundations of the city's perceived might, its ceaseless heartbeat and electric glow, could be so utterly, decisively, and terrifyingly stopped by 3 relentless days of pure, indifferent cold, would be a truth burned into the collective consciousness of its survivors. The frozen nightmare would end, yes, but New York, and all who survived it, would forever bear the profound, humbling, and utterly chilling scars of the Arctic embrace, a chilling reminder that even the mightiest can fall, silent and still, when nature truly decides to pull the plug.